Okay, Wade, you've got one, and Wayne's got one.
Hello. Hey, Brooks, Wade Hall. I've always been told that the good Lord made economists in order to make weather forecasters look good. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to ask you a question about new housing starts. I've recently read that foreclosure rates are at the lowest rate in 10 years and that new and existing home inventories are at a pretty low rate. How much does that factor into your projections of housing starts, if any at all?
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is super important. So two parts to that question. One is how important are things like foreclosures and inventories to our housing projection, and then to the way we use it. It doesn't factor in at all to our housing forecast. So it is not in there at all unless the forecasts that we're using are accounting for it in advance. With respect to our work, it's incorporated a lot. So we look at all those numbers, and the reason we look at those numbers is so you project the housing and then you want to go, well, does this thing make sense? And so then we start to look at those numbers. And so those numbers become really important. For example, the inventory number is critically important because if housing inventories are too high, there's no reason to build more homes and there's not going to be any sales. So the inventory is one I track really closely. And if I can, we're supposed to be like ice cold Mr. Spock looking at the numbers, but it always makes me excited to see inventories go low, and so they are super low, and that's a really positive sign for us.
Wayne Bell.
I'd like to compliment you on including something in silviculture and getting that survey started. That's very interesting. But a question for Amanda. Would you speculate why the plywood capacity is shifted to the west? I don't think you told us why. If you've got an idea, I'd like to hear it.
Thanks, Wayne. And Wayne's question was, why did the plywood capacity shift more to the west than it was in the south? And one of the drivers of this was really the contraction of the industry in the south. So a lot of southern mills shut their doors and reduced capacity. And OSB is a very large industry in the south. The mills in the south make up 80% of the overall OSB capacity. So really more of that in the south is shifting towards OSB and away from plywood, whereas in the west there's really not a lot of OSB production capacity, really none at all, because the log size just doesn't really make sense for it. OSB is really a product made from smaller logs and smaller wood. It's chipped up and made into panels, whereas with plywood, it really does rely on supply of larger logs, which are consistent in the West. And so the OSB industry really doesn't make a lot of sense for the timber in the West, whereas plywood does. So the plywood industry has been fairly consistent in the West, where it's really contracted in the South and shifted more towards OSB than plywood here. And a lot of the driver is log size.
Johnny.
Amanda, this could be directed to you also. Many of us took note in a recent issue of Georgia Trend magazine that there was a promotion of tree-free wood, or tree-free paper, excuse me. Not that it had any immediate concern for the demand for wood for pulp, but the public perception that may be incorporated in that. Do y'all have any comments on that for the long-term viability of our markets?
Thank you. So the question was, how might ideas like tree-free paper and this perception that using trees may be bad, how might that affect our markets and factor into markets moving forward? I think it's a very important message, and I think it's one of the things that groups like the GFA really work to advocate is really the sustainability of our industry and how trees and wood really benefit our consumers, and also how healthy markets really incentivize healthy forests. If we don't have markets for the timber, then we're not really going to have an incentive to keep land and trees. And landowners are going to want to move that production to other things so they can pay their taxes and make money, at least for the landowners that are incentivized by economics. So it's a very important message. Certainly super important as we have some headwinds for like what Andres was talking about yesterday, some headwinds in cities, even in Georgia, that are looking at having regulations against building taller buildings with wood and these types of things. So public perception is certainly very important, and we think that it's very important for us to get our message out there so we can continue to service our markets in our world and continue to create healthy markets for our landowners. So super important point. Thank you.
Puneet, you have a question? Use the mic, please.
Do we have any movement on CLTs in South, cross-laminated timber products?
So the question was about cross-laminated timber and if that factors in anywhere. We do have some producers making that today. I don't have a number for you on what that capacity looks like and how that might change over time, but there are companies that are investing in that technology, and it's certainly coming here, but I don't have a number for you right now. Thank you.
Mr. Hodges.
I'm not sure either Amanda or Brooks, maybe y'all can answer this together. With the way you had a slide that talked about the overcapacity of saw timber and that's going to continue, the reality is that the way the mills are nowadays, at some point, there's going to be a new class of saw timber that's too big for the mills to use. Do y'all account for that in your numbers? And because you don't cut it, it's going to grow too big, and it's going, that's going to be a whole nother issue. But anyway, just wondering how that's addressed.
Yeah, this is important as well. The question is, we've been growing some timber for so long that it's gotten so big we can't use it anymore. And you actually see it in some of the stumpage prices as well, where some of the oversized wood is actually trading at a discount relative to your more standard size saw timber logs. When we do some of our supply projections, we often screen out some of the biggest logs. We focus first on screening out wood that is inaccessible or what we think is unavailable, at least in theory, which is stuff growing on super steep slopes or stuff growing in really wet areas, hydric sites, because in practice, it's possible a lot of that wood's not being harvested. And then when we break it up into size classes, we do try to screen out some of the biggest stuff. We'll have a size class that has a cap on it. We are interested in this issue. It helps explain a little bit why maybe plywood has been flat, because actually those logs are cheap. And so plywood stopped shrinking because they're like, boy, we got some well-priced raw material and there's an opportunity to play ball here for a little while. So that's been a small positive spotlight in some of those mid-Gulf states with respect to their plywood facilities.
Sure.
I heard you mention about conservation lands, but are carbon credits a factor in taking land and the production of timber out for, typically those are about 100 years. Are they any factor at all in any of your work?
We're watching it, but today they don't move the needle. Yeah.
Other questions? So I've got one for you, Brooks. Been reading a lot here in the last couple of weeks about cross-laminated timber and tall buildings. So, and right now, and they're being built worldwide, maybe a 80-story building proposed in London with wood as the structural component. Do you see that catching on? And if it does, will that move our needle?
So this is the question about CLT and tall buildings. It's a very sexy idea, right? Skyscrapers being made out of wood. But what's the reality here? Really, it's a marketing effort to get more wood into the system. The real opportunity for us in terms of CLT and other wood use in more commercial residences is just getting the 2, 3, 4, 5-story office buildings to use wood. That's where the real growth opportunity is. And so if you can show you can do an 80-story, it makes it much easier to sell the 3-story strip mall or office complex on wood, and that's the real play. And so we understand why they're doing that. It's super interesting. It grabs everybody's attention. It creates clicks on the web when people go through those stories. And then the idea is that it changes the thinking for architects and builders to use more wood and more of the commercial applications. If you can if you look at the stats on commercial building and how much wood they use, it's tiny. You don't need to have big growth rates in commercial applications. Again, just the 2, 3, 4, 5-story buildings in wood to literally increase demand by billions of board feet of softwood lumber. So if the tall building translates into more demand for those levels of construction, it would be super helpful.
Thank you, Brooks. Do we have any last questions?
I guess this would be for Sean. As the transportation costs go up and as the cost of the salaries go up for your loggers, obviously that money's got to come from somewhere. Is that going to come from the seller, from the landowner, or are the prices? Do you anticipate prices going up? Any of you could answer this, because I'm seeing that in the small operation that we have.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and not terribly easy to answer exactly where it's going to come from. In the past, when a little bit of extra money has been tried to go trickle down into the logging sector, it often ends up on the stump. And so it tends to be a sort of a fluid process. You probably will see a little bit of a translation into higher delivered prices, and typically you won't see as much pressure on the stumpage side, but it's hard to say exactly where that's going to flow through from, unless someone else has a different view on that. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Yes.
Got a question for Amanda. We saw the capacity that we had for saw timber and the inventory being 13 million tons, but we saw the annual use too for pulpwood at 21. So my question is there a forecast for what the inventory is going forward in pulpwood and the demand?
So the question was, do we have a forecast for what pulpwood inventories will look like and also what demand might look like for the pulpwood? And to answer the question, yes, we do forecast pulpwood inventories as well as grade inventories, and the pulpwood situation on the stump is, of course, much different than the saw timber situation. One of the things that happened during the recession was some landowners deferred harvest but continued thinning activities. And now, so that the increased thinning activity got the wood that was ready to be thinned, and so now that is out of the system, and we deferred harvest, which deferred planting. So now we actually have a little bit of a shortage of pulpwood across the South, including in Georgia. And as we project that forward over the next 10 years, that actually continues to tighten for a lot of states in the South, including Georgia, where we have a tightness in pulpwood and we have the oversupply in terms of grade situation. We think demand for pulpwood is going to continue to increase a little bit as we have more bioenergy activity coming online, and considering that pulp and paper mills are really not in aggregate reducing demand, although there could be some local reductions. So as demand is going to maintain or slightly increase and our pulpwood supplies are decreasing, it implies a pricing pressure on pulpwood and also implies an opportunity to use larger size wood, which is continuing to grow on the stump.
Can you expand that on into the grade log as well?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Add that to the grade log equation as well. You know, what the same question, but about grade log.
Same question, but what is the inventory going to do for grade logs and what is demand going to do? Yes, absolutely. We project that grade inventories are going to continue to increase. And I did have the slide that had the states in the South and what that might look like. So a state-by-state situation is different. For Georgia, we're projecting about a 10% increase in pine grade inventory in the next 10 years. For states like Mississippi, a much larger increase. So it depends on the state and what the local profile looks like for those forests there. Overall, demand for saw timber we project is going to increase as housing continues to increase and demand for lumber continues to increase. So we'll have increasing demand, but also increasing supply, and the percentages of how that supply might increase versus demand will vary locally, but we do think both will increase.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, sir. Go right ahead, plenty.
If the pulp demand is there, then why are at least my loggers on quota? And they cannot send. Tell me why. Because I'm having trouble getting things harvested.
Well, I mean, like we always tell, timber markets are uniquely local. So that's my economist, right? But the reality of it is that a lot of our work, and it's for this exact reason that you're talking about, is a lot of our work is quarter to quarter, year to year. And we know the week to week volatility of prices, demand, and quotas, we don't capture. Very difficult to capture. What we really drive is we want to know what the pipeline looks like. Because if we get the pipeline wrong, all bets are off. And so that's how we spend all of our time. And for our story, the pipeline is the number of mills and how much wood they can use, the number of loggers and how much wood they can move, the inventory of wood on the ground and what that implies for supplies, and what the respective yields at each of these different facilities looks like around the country. So when we get sometimes I get a phone call and says, Brooks, you said prices were going to be this, and it'll be April 5th, I said, yeah, let's talk at the end of the year when all the curves come together. But the week by week, it's a very hard story to explain. I mean, it's even in the story that Amanda's sharing with respect to pulpwood and grade inventories. There's all these factors that cycle through, even things like residual chips. And when you do a projection, we assume a saw timber log that we forecast today is the same saw timber log we're going to be growing in 10 years. And we know for a fact that won't be the case. And so some of these things are what we try to account for qualitatively. So we don't know the answer to the question, but we're super sensitive to it when we do our work.
Any other questions? Yes, Earl.
Brooks, this is for you as well, being an expert forecaster. If you were advising an investor who was looking to invest in the forest industry in some capacity, where would you advise them to go for the best opportunities, both long-term and short-term?
And are you a timberland investor or are you a forest industry mill operator? Yes, the answer was yes. I'll tell you that a couple things. So where are the best opportunities? And we can talk about it nationally. I mean, first and foremost, at a regional level, the U.S. South is one of the best investment regions in the world, period. The demand is there, the supply is there. The issue is, if you're not in the South already, it's very expensive to get in. So from a timberland side, if you want to get into the timberland sector today and you're not already a timberland owner, it's pricey. And you're going to buy all the benefits that people apply to timberlands, which is inflation hedging and access to markets and all this stuff. But if you're a timberland owner in the South and somebody asks me, should I get out of the South? My answer would be no. This is the time to be an owner here because it's quite attractive. Even with us growing inventory on the stump, the fact is that growing inventory is a magnet for capital. That's what it's doing. It's attracting capital. Now, if I was on the capital side, wood using capacity, the story's a little more nuanced because there are places in the South that are clearly more attractive than others. And so let's just think about the chart that Amanda shared. Where's all the wood? So we have clients, and this is the first question when we're allocating capital for mills. Where should those mills go? First and foremost, where's the wood? Is it accessible, available, and sustainable? And you look at places like Mississippi, and you go, holy smokes, look at all that wood. The wood is there, and that is an industry in Mississippi that was twice as big 10 years ago. They were pumping twice as much volume through the system as they are today. So if you're forward thinking on a wood using side, that's the kind of place you're going. You're looking at parts of Mississippi, you're looking at parts of Alabama. You were looking at Arkansas, but Arkansas has become quite competitive, and a lot of people went there. It's a super place to do business. quite attractive for a profile, and they've received a lot of capital. But if I was starting from scratch and I didn't know anything and I wanted to put a mill down somewhere, assuming that I believe we're going to be building 1.5 million housing starts in the future, because that's the key, I'd put a spot in Mississippi.
In your projections, I've not heard anything about poles. Are you considering them a part of grade timber? Okay.
Other questions? Got one in the back.
So the question was about hardwood, asking what percentage of the market in Georgia is hardwood, and we don't have those numbers available, but we can get back to you. So see us after the session, and we'll be sure to get you those numbers, because we do track hardwood markets. We just didn't prepare that for today. Thank you.
Other questions?
Looking at the housing starts numbers being positive and knowing the lessons that we learned back in '09 and the lending industry and the banking changes, could you speak to what you feel like is driving those housing starts and what may have changed that may make those numbers more solid? Are they solid, and kind of what's the driver behind that?
Yeah, so this is important. Like, how much do we actually believe the housing starts will be there and they'll stay there for the long term? And so the question earlier about inventories was really important, because this is part of that equation. So for me, there's two things I look at. One is we looked at historic housing levels and the construction, and the question we asked was, how robust were those numbers in the first place? In other words, so we built 2.1 and change housing starts 10 years ago, and what did we learn from that? And there were several things that would have turned on the engine light for us. One was, by far the highest levels, percentage of homeowner rates in the history of the country. The mortgage rates, the quality of those loans were very poor, and then we were accumulating inventory of homes to sell on the I keep using on the stump, but actually in development. So all of those are warning lights, right? And so they're the same warning lights that we can look at today. So homeownership rates have come down; they're closer to historic levels. Inventories are down, and it's harder to get a loan. And so each of those things gives us some confidence that the housing starts we're looking at moving forward are more robust. The other thing is sort of the physical story of who's buying homes and how they're getting there is better. We've been growing households faster than we've been growing demand or sales of homes. And so I know it's a story that plays out in the press. When is everybody going to move their kids out of the house, and when are they going to buy a home? But that is part of the story, and we're wondering what that is actually going to look like. Right now, we're building homes at a pace that's slower than the replacement rate. So not only do we have low inventory, we actually have homes that are not livable, whatever that means, growing at a faster rate than we're building them. So this is exactly the time when you'd expect home construction to pick up.
Still got time for questions, if there are any? Okay, well, let's give Brooks and Amanda and Sean another round of applause. And for each of you from GFA, a token of appreciation for the time you prepared and your presentation. So we're right on time. We'll have lunch in 15 minutes in ballrooms E and G for the annual awards lunch. And we'll be back in here for the second session this afternoon. Please do not forget to drop by the registration desk if you have not picked up your CFE or CLE forms. They're there for you. And thank you for your time this morning.